For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, the combat planes that decided the greatest naval encounter the world had ever seen, the Battle of Midway, including the Japanese Zero that amounted to the most feared fighter plane of World War II.
A little kind of sports car of a fighter plane.
The Japanese Val dive bombers that helped sink the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. The deadly Dauntless SBD torpedo bomber that turned the tide of war.
The SBD is one of the greatest airplanes we had in World War II, bar none.
And the weaving American Wildcats that outwitted the Japanese Zeros.
The Wildcat had one major advantage, and that was a tremendous capacity to climb to great heights.
The objective? Sink the enemy's aircraft carriers first.
What you have to do is get your strike in before the enemy has flown off his strike. This is going to be the key to the Battle of Midway.
It was combat aircraft that determined the outcome of the most decisive naval battle of World War II. The epic clash between the Japanese Imperial Forces and the United States of America took place on June 4th, 1942, off the tiny island of Midway, a US territory that was dead center of the Pacific Ocean. The two sides faced off exclusively in the air.
Midway is the first great fleet battle in which the two sides never saw each other. The battle was conducted entirely through the air.
The stakes could not have been higher. Whoever's planes sunk the other's aircraft carriers first would win the battle and wrest control of the Pacific.
The nearly unique thing about the Battle of Midway was the almost complete destruction of the main battle force. Even the Battle of Trafalgar, in which Nelson all but annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets in 1805, did not destroy every single ship, but at Midway, they did. Every aircraft carrier was sunk.
The events that led to the Great Naval Battle began 6 months earlier in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December the 7th, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The surprise attack on the US, launched by the Japanese Imperial Strike Force, known as the Kido Butai, included 4 aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and 353 combat aircraft. In just 90 minutes, the Japanese attack sunk or seriously damaged 5 of the 8 US battleships and killed over 2,400 American soldiers, sailors, and civilians. The shocking blow brought the US into World War II.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, the Japanese strike force was back. This time, they were after the 3 remaining US aircraft carriers that were still intact.
The Japanese commander of the combined fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, devised a plan to lure those American carriers out into deep water. His plan was that his carriers would attack Midway Atoll, some hundreds of miles north of Pearl Harbor. The carriers would then come out of that harbor and then would be pounced on by the Japanese carrier and destroyed.
The ultimate goal was to rule over the Pacific and expand the Japanese empire. To do that, the Japanese first had to wipe the US Navy off the map. Ground zero for the great naval battle was the island of Midway, a tiny coral atoll.
Midway, as you'll gather from its name, is midway between everywhere, between east and west, between north and south. It's the pivot point in the center of the Pacific, and whoever has Midway moves forward, whoever loses it moves backwards. For the Americans, Midway really is the last defense before you get to Hawaii and the main fleet base at Pearl Harbor.
Spearheading the Japanese charge, the masses of combat aircraft of the Kido Butai.
Over 300 combat airplanes, actually more than 400 combat airplanes if they could get them all in the air, was the greatest naval striking force on the planet.
In total, there were 72 of the Aichi D-3A, the dreaded Japanese Val dive bomber that wreaked havoc at Pearl Harbor a few months earlier. It was powered by a 1,300 horsepower Mitsubishi Kinsei piston engine. It had 3 7.7mm light machine guns, 2 fixed to fire forward and 1 fixed to fire back. But its most important armament was its high incendiary bombs. The most lethal ship killer in the Japanese aerial arsenal was codenamed the Val by US intelligence.
It had a capacity of carrying 3 bombs, 2 on wing drops that were really quite small. The large bomb, 250 kilogram bomb, was capable of taking out almost any vessel. When you look at the total tonnage of shipping lost during World War II, the Val dive bomber sunk more ships than any other Axis plane.
Loaded with high explosives, a successful dive bomb mission rested on the skill and unerring courage of the pilot.
A dive bomber, like a fighter in World War II, depended on speed for effect. Their best speed when they were in a steep dive. The dive bomber has 1 shot. It's like a muzzleloader. He has 1 chance to do it right.
In the early hours of June the 4th, 1942, the Japanese strike force launched its attack on Midway. A squadron of 108 combat planes took off from the decks of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in the Kido Butai. Their target, the runways, aircraft and fuel depots of the American base. Escorting 72 Japanese bombers in the battle over Midway Island was the most feared attack plane in the Pacific theater, the Mitsubishi Zero Fighter. It was typically armed with 2 fixed forward firing 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons in its wings. It could also carry a 132-pound bomb under each wing. With a 1,330 horsepower air-cooled engine, the Japanese fighter could reach an altitude of over 37,000 feet and achieve a top speed of 354 miles an hour.
The Japanese had some of the best combat planes in the world. Everyone knows about the Zero, the Americans called the Zeke. It was highly maneuverable, very light, a little kind of sports car of a fighter plane. Its weakness was that it had no armor. One of the reasons it could climb swiftly and maneuver so tightly was because it had very little armor.
And the Americans also faced Japanese pilots who had far more combat experience.
They were in combat over China for a long period of time. These were the best naval aviators in the world.
36 Zeros led the Japanese attack on the US airbase on Midway Island. The Japanese Air Force fully expected, as they had at Pearl Harbor, to surprise and stun the Americans. But the US Intelligence Gathering Service had been hard at work.
American code breakers had broken enough of the Japanese operational code so that they were able to discern not every detail of what the Japanese were planning to do, but the broad strokes of it. The Japanese plan was that the Americans would be surprised by this attack. Instead, of course, the Americans had been at sea for several days already and were well north, not only of Midway, but of the Japanese themselves.
The Japanese had just lost the elements of surprise. But with 4 aircraft carriers and over 300 combat planes ready to attack, the Japanese strike force still posed an ominous threat. Their plan was to destroy the last 3 US aircraft carriers, bring American military to its knees, and drive them out of the Pacific. But the Americans had cracked the Japanese secret code and knew they were coming.
The Americans left Pearl Harbor before the Japanese had anticipated they would do, and they, in turn, set up an ambush of the Japanese from the northeast quadrant beyond Midway.
A US PBY Catalina reconnaissance seaplane reported sighting the first wave of 108 Japanese combat planes heading towards the US base on Midway.
Well, of course, this just electrified everybody back at Midway.
The US garrison scrambled, and in the face of overwhelming odds, the Americans launched the few fighter planes they had on the island, including 21 aging Brewster Buffaloes and 7 Grumman Wildcat strike planes.
It really was the superior aircraft carrier fighter in the world. Wildcat had 4 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in each wing. The Wildcat had one major advantage, and that was a tremendous capacity to climb to great heights for coming down from above.
In addition to those on Midway Island, there were a total of 85 US Wildcats in the battle zone. Most of the US fighters flew off one of the 3 US aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, that were steaming toward the Japanese strike force. With space at a premium on the aircraft carrier, the Wildcats had been specially designed to fit on deck by New York-born aeronautical engineer and former test pilot Leroy Grumman himself.
Grumman famously came up with a way to resolve that problem by having wings that folded, and not just folded upwards, but folded up and then back, and they developed the first real movable wing for aircraft.
6 a.m. At first light, the first wave of 108 Japanese combat planes, including Zeros and Val dive bombers, had the US Air Base on Midway in their crosshairs. Outnumbered by superior Japanese planes and pilots, 31 American fighters took to the skies to defend the Midway Air Base. Leading the charge, 5 Wildcats.
Very capable aircraft, but it's not as agile or as maneuverable as the Japanese Type 0.
The battle in the sky that morning all went one way.
The Americans put a lot of planes up, but they all got shot down. These were not the best American planes, and they were not the best trained American pilots. So a lot of men went up in second-rate aircraft and didn't come back.
By 6:45 a.m., 17 of the 30 American fighters were swiftly taken down. In defense, the US Midway garrison, including fighters and anti-aircraft gunners, shot down 11 Japanese planes and severely damaged a further 14.
The Japanese lost some planes, but they achieved a large part of their mission, but not everything. They hadn't finished the job, and as they're coming back, they're reporting back that there'll be a necessity for a second strike.
As the Japanese Imperial forces prepared a second attack on Midway, the Americans seized the initiative and mustered their air force to strike back. 7 a.m. Having left Midway prior to the Japanese attack, 6 brand new US torpedo bombers were on course to be the first to find and attack the Kido Butai. It carried more than enough munitions to do it. The American Avenger had the biggest payload of any other single-engine fighter in World War II.
It's a very special aircraft. It's a very powerful aircraft. Its main role was a torpedo bomber and a dive bomber. It was loaded with just about a 1,000-pound torpedo. You only had one torpedo, which would mean you only have one chance to get it right. It was very difficult to fly. It's like flying a giant truck.
The Battle of Midway was the Avenger's first ever combat mission. Flying at 4,000 feet above the Pacific, the 6 new torpedo bombers and their freshly trained pilots spotted the Japanese aircraft carrier, the Akagi. They dropped to 200 feet for the run-in.
The 6 Avengers thought, well, we're cutting-edge technology. We'll make mincemeat of these guys. But there are only 6 of them that arrived together.
But protecting the Akagi were 28 Japanese Zeros flying combat air patrol.
The initial attack on the Akagi by 6 brand new Avenger torpedo bombers was very brave. It wasn't very wise. The Japanese had plenty of fighters up.
The Zeros coming in from great height took them out very quickly.
Flying in formation some minutes behind the Avengers were the Americans' dive and heavy bombers, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-26 Marauders. They all took off from the US base on Midway.
The Americans would like to have conducted a coordinated strike. That is, all the planes working together with the dive bombers coming in high and the torpedo bombers coming in low, protected by the fighter. None of that happened. 1, they weren't used to cooperating. 2, they were flying different kinds of airplanes that flew at different speeds.
Unprotected by fighter escorts, the slow-moving American B-26 Marauders plowed ahead. But the US bombers didn't hit a single Japanese ship.
Land-based aviators who used to bombing things that are stationary often get it wrong. They misjudge the speed, they misjudge the turning power of these ships, and so a lot of bombs end up in the ocean.
The first bomb run by the land-based US combat planes dissolved into a suicide mission.
Japanese fighters made short work of all the other planes launched from Midway. It's around 80 or so planes.
But their sacrifice was not in vain. The waves of American bombers would play a pivotal role in the ensuing battle. When the Americans attacked, the Japanese had to take evasive maneuvers, and that came at a cost.
They have to stop everything else to deal with that threat. So these attacks from the land at Midway are effective in delaying and harassing the Japanese, even if they're not actually doing them any damage.
At 7:45 a.m., a Japanese scout plane reported sighting 10 US ships 240 miles northeast of the Japanese strike force. Admiral Nagumo was still expecting the US aircraft carriers to be coming from Pearl Harbor. He didn't know that the Americans had cracked the Japanese code.
What kind of ships, he asks. Kind of important. A few minutes go by and the pilot reports, well, it's 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Well, that's okay, no carriers, so that's all right. I can go ahead and finish the attack on Midway, and so that's what he does. So he brings up the kind of weaponry you would use to attack an island, explosive bombs. And then a report comes in.
8 a.m. A message comes in from the Japanese scout planes reporting that they had found the USS Yorktown, and it was heading for the Kido Butai from the northeast. It was about 200 miles away, and crucially for Admiral Nagumo, just outside of the US combat planes' range, but within range of his lighter Japanese strike planes.
And the decision which decides everything is, how do we respond to finding the Americans?
But Admiral Nagumo was preparing to attack the American base on Midway Island. A change in battle plan to attack US aircraft carriers would cost Nagumo valuable time. because his planes are carrying the wrong type of bombs to drop on ships.
So Nagumo now goes for the option to rearm his torpedo bombers with torpedoes because that's the way to sink ships. So they take the bombs off the torpedo planes and put the torpedoes back on, and this eats up time.
And that's not all. The Japanese planes were stored below deck and had to be brought up one by one to be rearmed.
Rearming planes is a very difficult process. The bombs are heavy, and they have to be positioned under a plane, fastened, and then cranked, hand cranked up into place. All that takes time.
But with the US aircraft carriers and their strike planes closing in, time was running out for Admiral Nagumo and the Japanese strike force.
At the time, he thought better to go with a full punch. We'll really win this thing. Give me 30 minutes.
The Americans and the Japanese knew that the first to knock out the other's aircraft carriers would win the battle and tip the scales towards victory in World War II.
In the Kido Butai on the Japanese side, one man, Chiuchu Nagumo, could decide what all 6 of the carriers were doing and what they would launch and when they would launch it.
But the Americans beat him to the punch by launching first. The strike squadron flying off the decks of the US aircraft carriers included Wildcat fighters and heavy bombers, as well as Avengers, and the longest-serving and most reliable torpedo bomber in the US arsenal, the Devastator. But due to poor coordination, the Devastators arrived alone.
The American torpedo planes, the slowest, most lumbering planes in the entire strike force, arrived ahead of the bombers, much faster, or the fighters, much, much faster, by themselves without any protection.
The American plan is to send up all of their planes in one formation, torpedo, dive, bombers, and fighters, so the fighters can protect the attack and deliver it to the target. But almost as soon as they take off, this breaks down, and the different parts of different ships' squadrons wander around the sky, taking different courses and making very different decisions.
9:20 a.m. A seasoned American pilot from the USS Hornet had made a maverick decision to find the Japanese aircraft carriers. 41-year-old Lieutenant Commander Jack Waldron was leading Torpedo 8 Squadron, made up of 15 Devastators, when he disobeyed orders and changed course, based on his gut instinct.
Very proud of his Sioux Indian ancestry and claimed he had a sixth sense about such things, but he had also worked out the coordinates of where the Japanese carriers would be, and he saw that the group leader was leading them in a different direction, almost due west. So he broke off and took his 15 planes to the southwest.
With his radio on the whole time, US commanders were able to monitor his journey.
Waldron was so sure that he knew where the enemy was. He'd rather risk his professional career and certainly his life to get a strike against the Japanese carriers, rather than fly in what he believed was the wrong trajectory.
The American pilot's instincts proved to be right, and Waldron and his torpedo squadron successfully located the Japanese aircraft carriers. But being right cost Waldron and his squadron dearly. From their perch at 20,000 feet, flying combat air patrol over the Kido Butai, the fastest and most agile planes in the fight, Japanese Zeros, swooped down on US Torpedo Squadron 8 with all guns blazing.
His 15-plane squadron was annihilated. Every plane was shot down, every pilot and backseat gunner was killed except for one man, and that's the pilot of the tail-end airplane, with Ensign George Gay, who was the squadron navigator.
George Gay had his Mae West life vest on as his only protection. He was wounded and bleeding, but he, bobbing in the water, was the sole American witness to what happened next.
What George Gay saw was the American strike by another 14 Devastators. This time, the squadron had been launched from the USS Enterprise.
At this point, the dive bombers arrive over the target, having been led there by a Japanese destroyer and Japanese smoke.
to warn Admiral Nagumo of the approaching threat from Waldron's torpedo squadron. The Japanese cruisers nearby sent out smoke signals.
Black clouds of smoke go up into the air to draw attention to that quadrant of the compass so they would see these planes coming. And it seems that some of the torpedo planes from the other American carriers saw that smoke as well, and that allowed them to find the Kido Butai.
At 9:30 a.m., devastators from the USS Enterprise were about to fly into a swarm of Japanese Zeros.
The Devastator was up against very fast, agile fighters in the hands of expert pilots. They stood no chance whatsoever. Like so many of the American air attacks against the Kido Butai, they failed miserably.
But while they failed to achieve their primary objective, the US Devastator pilots did make one vital contribution to the American effort.
They brought the Japanese combat air patrol, the Zero fighters, down to low level. You know, a torpedo plane has to attack from only about 100, 150 feet, and they have to come in low and slow to drop that torpedo, so that in order to shoot them down, the Zeros came down to their level. That brought them down from 20,000 feet, so that later on in the morning, when the dive bombers arrived, they were virtually unmolested.
By ceding airspace at 20,000 feet, it cleared the path for America's newest dive bomber, the high-flying scout bomber Douglas, also known as the SBD.
One of the greatest airplanes we had in World War II, bar none. The SBD has several affectionate nicknames. One, of course, is the slow but deadly, because it wasn't real fast, but it was highly accurate and very easy to deliver the bomb. The SBD doesn't look like much when you look at it. You really don't think that that could be a potent weapon, but what a punch it could pack. The SBD is powered by a Wright 1820 cubic inch engine, 1,200 horsepower.
The SBD was designed to roll easily, go into a steep dive, and then release a lethal payload.
When they roll into their dive, they spread the dive flaps or the spoilers, and they come up, and you have this big wedge on the back of the wing that creates drag and keeps them at a reasonable airspeed so they don't exceed their structural airspeed during the dive.
The pilot uses hydraulic power to open the bay doors and drop the bomb.
When the bomb is released, you move the lever to close the flaps. With the wind load and the hydraulic power, they just slam shut instantaneously. They had two forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. The rear gunner sat here. He had two 30 caliber machine guns. His job was to protect the rear of the airplane. Behind the pilot is a good-sized sheet of steel plate armor.
The SBD Dauntless earned a reputation as the street fighter of the US Navy.
It definitely got into the alleyways, if you know what I mean, and took the fight straight to them. There was no bombing from miles up in the sky, none of that. It was in your backyard, doing it right now. You had to have that dauntless frame of mind to carry out that mission into extreme danger all the time.
The pilot would wait until he was sure of a hit, usually within 2,000 feet of the ship, before he released the bomb.
Think of the SBD as the rifle that delivered that bomb. We aimed the airplane at the ship to release the bomb. It was a phenomenal aircraft with a lot of brave men rolling in those dives to do it.
10:05 a.m. Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey and a squadron of 33 American Dauntless dive bombers, flying at an altitude of about 20,000 feet, were now fast approaching the Kido Butai. After the failure of dozens of US bombers to hit the Japanese strike force, this was the Americans' last hope of sinking the Japanese fleet.
You did not want to be on a ship with SBDs rolling down on you, because it was not going to be a good day.
As McCluskey's squadron closed in on the Japanese aircraft carriers, On board the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was still racing to rearm his bombers to strike back. But his Zeros were out of position, down around 1,000 feet in altitude.
Most of their fighters have now come down to low level to shoot down the torpedo bombers.
The challenge for the Japanese was they had not had time between the torpedo bomber strike and this strike for their Zeros to gain enough altitude to come in from above them.
With the Zeros out of position, the skies were clear, and the Americans had a clean run-in.
You couldn't write this, and if you wrote it as a script, no one would believe you. It's now, of course, the script of every science fiction movie ever. It is the script of Star Wars.
10:20 a.m. The American Dauntless dive bombers now had all 4 Japanese Imperial aircraft carriers in their sights. But success for the Americans was still elusive. So far, nearly 100 combat planes had been lost in 7 separate strike waves. The Americans' Dauntless dive bomber, officially called the Scout Bomber Douglas, was the next plane into the fray. That morning, it was the American plane's scout role that proved vital.
They would run 10-degree arcs all over the Pacific out in advance of the carriers on patrol, looking for enemy action.
As radar technology was new at the beginning of World War II, finding enemy targets was an inexact science. Once again, it was one pilot's bold individual decision that allowed the Americans to find the Japanese strike force. In this case, it was US Squadron Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey who trusted his instincts. He led 32 Dauntless dive bombers into the fight against the Japanese strike force, the Kido Butai. McCluskey's squadron came across a Japanese destroyer that was hunting a US submarine.
There was an American submarine out there, the USS Nautilus. Nagumo ordered a destroyer to go over there and keep him down. Now, drop depth charge on him, keep him down so he can't hurt us. And meanwhile, the Kido Butai steamed off to the northeast.
Intent on attacking the US fleet, the Kido Butai left the Japanese destroyer unprotected to take out the US submarine.
Well, when the destroyer finished that job, he then sought to catch up with them as fast as he could go. And when the bombers from the Enterprise arrived, and what they found was that destroyer. On the surface of the sea, 20,000 feet below, that bright white hyphen on a blue sea pointed the way for them to find the Kido Butai, which they did.
10:21 a.m. McCluskey had followed the trail of the Japanese destroyer all the way to the Kido Butai and was now ready to strike. Unlike the waves of attacks that came before, this time an American squadron had a sky free of Zeros.
He found that because of the sacrifice of the torpedo planes, the Japanese fighter planes were not up at 20,000 feet. He could line up on the carriers.
About 20,000 feet down below the SBDs were all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers: the Hiryu, the Soyu, the Kaga, and the flagship of the strike force, the Akagi. On board the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo and his crew were still consumed with refueling and rearming their bombers.
Planes are being refueled, there's aviation fuel, avgas all over the place, and they are running furiously to get this done, sweating as you can imagine. Because of that, they don't take the time to lower the ammunition taken off the planes down to the magazine. They just leave it stacked there.
10:22 a.m. Time for the Japanese admiral and his crew had run out.
The tipping point in this battle can be identified very, very clearly. It comes at 10:22 on the morning of June 4th. That's the moment when Wade McCluskey gives the order to tip over and dive on the Kaga and the Akagi.
But there was a problem. All of McCluskey's 32 bombers were about to dive on just one aircraft carrier.
Well, he had 2 squadrons of bombers. Clearly, he didn't want all to go after the same ship.
But there was confusion over the radio, and the bulk of the SBDs had already dived onto the Kaga. McCluskey's trusted cohort, Richard Best, reacted.
Richard Best saw that it was happening and signaled as fast as he could to his squadron, don't dive, hold up, weight. The only ones who saw it in time were his two wingmen, one on each side of his airplane. Everybody else dove on the cockpit.
Best and his two wingmen rolled around, tipped over, and aimed their 3 SBDs at the Akagi and dived in.
I can't imagine rolling into that dive with all that anti-aircraft coming right back at you and not, not knowing if one of them has your name on it or not. Imagine being the guy in the back, being the gunner, riding that dive backward, diving down into a hell of anti-aircraft fire to deliver a bomb, getting that close.
From about 1,500 feet above the Akagi, Richard Best released just one bomb.
Richard Best's bomb hit right square in the middle of the flight deck on the edge of the elevator, penetrated to the hangar deck where all the Japanese planes were being refueled and rearmed, exploded, and created a dozen secondary explosions that turned the ship into an inferno.
One bomb. And this should have done very little damage, but in fact the Japanese hangars were full of fuel, aviation spirit, munitions.
It proved to be a fatal blow. Very seldom does one bomb sink something like an aircraft carrier or a battleship, but this one did.
Just as the Akagi was going down, a second Japanese aircraft carrier was also obliterated. The rest of McCluskey's dive bombers had successfully struck the Kaga. At the same time, a squadron of 17 slow but very deadly Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Yorktown struck the third of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers.
They find the Soryu, the third of the Japanese, and attack it.
They're all hit essentially by one bomb, and this should have done very little damage, but in fact it was devastating because Japanese fire safety and damage control procedures were very poor. So the ships didn't sink, they were burnt out.
With just a handful of bombs, the American SBD planes had effectively decided the Battle of Midway.
That's what turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. The SBD sank more enemy shipping, tonnage-wise, than any other U.S. airplane in World War II.
10:27 a.m. It took the Dauntless bombers and their brave pilots just 5 furious minutes to swing the balance of power to the U.S. in the Pacific.
Once the United States swooped in that 5 or 6 minutes of battle action, and 3 carriers out of 4 were put out of action.
I would say at 10:20 in the morning, the Japanese were clearly winning not only the battle, they were winning the war. At 10:22, when the dive bombers arrived, history pivoted so quickly and so spectacularly.
But there was one more Japanese aircraft carrier afloat, and it wasn't ready to surrender. Hidden in a rain cloud during the attack on the other 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Hiryu was still afloat. Down but not out, the last Japanese aircraft carrier and her crew decided to fight on.
It's interesting that the Japanese, with a single carrier, they didn't say, oh my gosh, we've lost 75% of our strike force, let's retreat. He said, we've lost 75% of our strike force, let's attack. And they did.
11 a.m. The Hiryu launches an airstrike against the USS Yorktown. The strike force was made up of 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Mitsubishi Zero fighters.
At this point, they fly off and they hit the Yorktown very hard. It's a torpedo hit and several bomb hits, and the Yorktown is left stopped, dead in the water.
But the Yorktown didn't go down. At 1:30, the Japanese launched a second strike. This time, however, the Americans were waiting. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, a squadron of Wildcats had prepared with a tactical maneuver designed to take down the superior performance Zeros. It was called the Thatch Weave.
Commander Thatch has produced a tactical solution to the problem of this very agile, maneuverable enemy plane. Basically, the 2 American fighters will work as a pair so that one of them is always covering the other one's back.
Also known as the beam defense position, the two US planes would weave intersecting flight paths to lure the enemy to attack one of them.
If the Japanese plane goes for the lead plane, it will be shot down by the second plane, and vice versa.
The aerial maneuver is still used to this day by US pilots.
Everybody who's watched Top Gun knows that American Navy fighters go out in pairs, and they have since 1942.
At Midway, the thatch weave helped defeat Japanese fighter pilots. By the end of the day, the Japanese would lose over 240 aircraft, compared to the American loss of about 150 planes. 2:55 p.m. The American Wildcat fighters, however, couldn't save the USS Yorktown. She was hit by two Japanese strikes and effectively finished off. At 5 p.m. that afternoon, the American bombers found and struck the fourth and final Japanese aircraft carrier.
Planes from the other American carriers find the Hiryu and put several bombs into its flight deck and send it to the bottom. So before the day was over, all four of the Japanese carriers had been sunk.
For the Japanese fleet, the sinking of the Hiryu was the final nail in the coffin. By June the 7th, 1942, the USA had won the battle, and now they had control of the Pacific. It would take 3 more years, but on September the 2nd, 1945, the Second World War ended in victory for the Allies. And it was all made possible by air power that won the day at Midway. In just 5 fateful minutes, robust combat planes, combined with the skill and the courage of US pilots, decided one of the greatest naval encounters the world had ever seen.